They didn't just abandon that old elephant. They chose an empty field where she could die unheard. When the rescue team got close, they realized Rosie wasn't just starving or exhausted. She had been used up. She wouldn't respond to food, water, or even human hands, until one distant call from another elephant reminded her who she still was. But leaving that field was not the same as being saved. To truly come back, Rosie would have to learn how to trust, how to belong, and eventually become the hope another broken soul needed to survive. The field lay open beneath a pale winter dawn, wide and colorless under a ceiling of low gray mist. Dry grass bent in the wind like old straw, whispering over the hard earth. Nothing moved out there except the fog itself, drifting slowly across the ground as if the morning were trying and failing to hide what had been left behind. At the center of that empty stretch lay an elephant so still she seemed part of the land. Her name was Rosie. She was old enough that time had settled into every line of her body, old enough that her bones showed sharp beneath her skin, old enough that even the cold light of morning made her look less like a living creature than the memory of one. She was resting on one side, her legs folded awkwardly beneath her, her trunk stretched into the grass as if it had simply grown too heavy to lift. One ear twitched now and then at flies she no longer had the strength to chase away. Her breathing was shallow, so slight that from a distance it would have been easy to mistake her for dead. A rusted stake had been driven into the dirt a few feet from her head. A frayed length of rope still clung to it, one end dark with mud, the other cut clean through. Nearby sat a dented plastic bucket turned on its side and a torn sack that had once held cheap feed pellets. Whoever had brought Rosie here had not been careless. They had been finished. The tracks were fresh enough to hold their shape in the morning frost. Deep tire marks cut through the grass and stopped near the place where Rosie lay, then curved back toward the narrow dirt road at the edge of the field. There were no other footprints except a few from a farmer who had stood far off and made a phone call he clearly hadn't wanted to make. He had called because he did not want a dead elephant on his land. That was the truth of it. Not compassion, not outrage, not pity. Just fear of what a body that large would mean if it rotted there in the sun. And yet his voice had shaken when he described her, because even from the road he had understood that something cruel had happened in that field before daylight ever came. Rosie did not lift her head when a crow landed on the rope stake. She did not react when the bird hopped closer, bold with hunger. Her eye, the one that still saw, remained half open and clouded with exhaustion. There was no panic in it, no warning, no plea. Only a strange blankness, as if whatever had once made her resist had been worn down long before this morning. The marks on her body told the story in pieces. Scar tissue circled one front ankle in a thick, pale ring where chains had rubbed for years. Her shoulders carried old ridges from repeated strikes. One ear was torn at the edge. The skin over her back was rough and cracked from heat and neglect. None of it looked fresh. That was what made it worse. This suffering had lasted a lifetime. Rosie had once been enormous in the way healthy elephants were meant to be, powerful and grounded and impossible to ignore. But hunger had hollowed her. Her hips rose like hard corners beneath sagging skin, and her ribs pressed faintly through her side each time she drew breath. Even lying still took effort now. The field had become the place where effort ended. A truck passed on the road sometime after sunrise. its engine low and distant. For a moment, one of Rosie's ears shifted toward the sound. It was the smallest movement, but it was enough to show she was still somewhere inside that failing body. Then the sound faded, and the ear fell still again. Whatever spark remained in her seemed to dim with the silence that followed. Far off, beyond the fence line, two children stood beside their father and stared across the field. The younger one asked if the elephant was sleeping. The father didn't answer right away. He kept his hand on the boy's shoulder and looked at Rosie with the guarded helplessness of someone who knew there were things in this world too large and too broken to fix with bare hands. By the time the sun began thinning the mist, the cold had settled deep into Rosie's joints. She tried once to gather her front legs beneath her, a slow, trembling effort that lifted her chest only an inch off the ground before it failed. Her body dropped back with a dull thud. Not dramatic, not violent, just heavy. The kind of sound that comes when hope has almost finished leaving. She stayed there after that, motionless except for her breath, while the light grew stronger around her. The field no longer looked hidden. It looked exposed, every cut of grass and every tire mark made plain. Somewhere beyond the road, an engine turned over and headed her way. Rosie did not know rescue was coming. She only knew the morning had arrived, and she was still alive in it. By the time the rescue truck reached the field, the frost had already begun to melt off the grass. Rosie had not moved from where they found her. She lay in the same crooked position, her trunk pressed into the dirt, her eye half open to a world she no longer seemed interested in reading. The engine noise did not startle her. Neither did the doors slamming shut. Dr. Emily Carter crossed the field first, boots darkened by wet soil, her medical bag knocking softly against her leg. Caleb Turner followed with water, blankets, and a folding shade tarp. While Nora Bell carried a bucket of cut fruit, Rosie was too weak to smell from a distance. None of them spoke, much at first. The silence around the elephant felt too heavy to interrupt. Emily had worked around injured horses, neglected cattle, and animals so traumatized they bit at air long after the danger had passed. But the moment she knelt beside Rosie, something inside her went still. Up close, the elephant's age was written everywhere. Her skin hung loose where muscle had wasted away. Her shoulder blades rose sharply beneath a film of dust and dried mud. Rosie's front ankle was thick with scar tissue, the kind left by years of metal grinding in the same place. Emily ran her hand just above it, careful, gentle, and felt the heat of infection beneath the skin. There were old lash marks across Rosie's shoulder and side, some faded silver, others still dark and ridged. Her left eye was clouded over, milk white and useless in the morning light. When Emily checked Rosie's mouth, the damage became harder to hide behind professional calm. Several molars were broken down, jagged and uneven, worn or snapped in ways that would have made chewing painful for a long time. Her gums were inflamed. The smell of dehydration and illness clung to her breath. Someone had kept using this elephant long after her body had run out of ways to keep up. Caleb moved toward the tire tracks and studied the ground, while Nora set the fruit nearby in case smell or memory could draw Rosie back. The tracks told their own story. A heavy vehicle had backed in close, paused, then pulled away. No signs of panic, no churned earth from a struggle. Whoever brought Rosie here had unloaded her like cargo, tied her off, and left with practiced efficiency. The farmer lingered near the road, hat in his hands, uneasily repeating what he had seen at dawn. A truck before sunrise, 2 men he didn't recognize. No shouting, no urgency, just the sound of a chain and then tires on dirt. He had stayed back because he was afraid. Emily did not judge him for that. Fear was honest. What had happened to Rosie was something colder than fear. When Nora tried to offer water by hand, Rosie did not lift her trunk. When Caleb spread the tarp and blocked the growing heat, she did not seem to notice the shade. Emily inserted a needle for fluids with the kind of care usually reserved for creatures still fighting to live. Rosie barely flinched. That was the moment the heartbreak sharpened. Pain could still be treated. Surrender was harder. Emily rested one hand against Rosie's neck to count the rhythm of her pulse. It was weak, uneven, but there. Rosie finally turned her eye toward her then, and Emily felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the weather. There was no fear in that gaze, no anger either, just a flat, exhausted acceptance, as if Rosie had already made peace with disappearing. Mid-morning heat gathered over the field. Flies settled at the corners of Rosie's eyes, and Nora brushed them away with slow, patient movements. Caleb returned from the road, carrying a pair of bolt cutters someone had discarded in the weeds. He held them up without saying much. Another piece of the same quiet brutality. Not an accident, not abandonment in panic, a planned ending for an old machine. Then Rosie moved. Not much, just a trembling attempt to gather her front legs beneath her. Her chest rose off the ground, her muscles straining under skin that seemed too thin to hold that much memory. Emily and Nora froze. Caleb took one step forward and stopped. For one suspended second, it looked as if Rosie might stand and pull herself back into the world on her own. Instead, her strength gave out. Her body dropped hard, the sound deep and heavy enough to shake the loose bucket nearby. Nora covered her mouth. Emily leaned in instantly, checking breath, heartbeat, the angle of Rosie's head. The elephant was still conscious, still breathing, but whatever that effort had cost her was written in the way her trunk went slack again, like something unfastened inside her. No one said it out loud, but all 3 of them understood the same thing. Rosie had not tried to stand because she trusted them. She had tried because some final instinct, buried under years of obedience and injury, had briefly flickered awake. And now that flicker seemed dimmer than before. The field felt larger after that, emptier, as if it were already making room for her absence. Emily sat beside Rosie through the noon hour, one hand resting against the rough curve of her shoulder, while fluids dripped slowly into her vein. Caleb radioed for more supplies. Nora replaced the uneaten fruit with fresh pieces, though she knew Rosie wouldn't touch them. Above them, the sky had cleared into a pale, hard blue. It should have looked hopeful. It didn't. Still, as the light softened toward afternoon, Emily noticed something small. Rosie's ear shifted once toward Nora's voice when she spoke from the other side of the tarp. A tiny movement, almost nothing, but enough to keep despair from fully settling in. Rosie had not chosen them. She had not chosen life. But some part of her was still listening, and for now, that had to be enough. The afternoon settled over the field with a strange, suspended stillness, as if even the wind had decided not to disturb what was happening there. Rosie remained beneath the shade tarp, her body stretched in the same exhausted angle, the IV line taped carefully against the tough skin of her ear. The fluids were helping her survive. They were not helping her want to. Emily had seen animals hover in that space before, somewhere between pain and surrender. But Rosie felt different. It was not only weakness, it was absence. Her body still answered certain physical truths: heat, pressure, thirst, fatigue. Yet something deeper had gone quiet. It was as if the part of her that once expected comfort or company or relief had been shut down years ago. Nora crouched a few feet away with another tray of food, softer this time. Bananas, melon, soaked pellets, cane chopped into shorter pieces. She set them close enough for Rosie to smell if she wanted to. Rosie did not lift her trunk. Not even a little. The fruit sat bright and untouched in the dirt, looking almost childish beside the sheer weight of the animal refusing it. Caleb spent part of the afternoon on the phone with Blue Haven, updating the sanctuary and asking what else could be brought out before dark. They were running through the usual options: additional fluids, sedation plans, transport angles, lifting straps, when Nora suddenly raised one hand for silence. At first, Emily thought Rosie had stopped breathing. Then she noticed Rosie's ear had shifted. It was a small movement, barely more than a twitch, but it was not random. Rosie's good ear had turned toward the road, toward something far beyond the field itself. All three of them listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing except distant traffic and the dry hiss of grass. Then, faint and low, there came a sound from half a mile away. Deep, resonant, almost more vibration than noise. The sanctuary's temporary holding yard sat in that direction. Emily remembered that one of Blue Haven's female elephants had been kept there during a fence repair. If the wind carried right, a call could travel farther than most people realized. Rosie's eye opened wider. Not fully, not brightly, but enough for Emily to see a flicker pass through it, thin as a match flame in a dark room. Nora looked at Caleb first. "She heard that?" she whispered, though no one needed telling. Rosie's ear moved again, more deliberately this time. Her trunk, which had lain slack against the dirt for hours, curled inward by less than an inch. It was almost nothing. Yet after the emptiness of the morning, that almost nothing landed with the force of a shouted answer. Caleb walked a short distance off and made another call, this time more urgent. When he came back, he was already opening a hard case from the truck. Inside was a portable field speaker used during transport and relocation work, usually for calming animals under stress. He scrolled through old recordings on his phone until he found what he needed: low elephant rumbles captured at the sanctuary months before. Emily should have felt ridiculous standing in the middle of a field, setting up a speaker for an elephant left there to die. Instead, she felt something closer to fear. Hope, at that stage, had become dangerous. Still, when Caleb placed the speaker near the tarp and nodded to Nora, none of them tried to stop what came next. He pressed play, and the field filled with the sound of another elephant calling. Rosie reacted before the first sequence had finished. Her ear lifted sharply, then her head moved against the ground. It was slow and trembling, but unmistakable. She was listening. Emily knelt closer, barely breathing herself, as Rosie's eye opened fully for the first time since they had arrived. There was confusion in it now, and strain, and something even more fragile than hope: recognition. The recording played again. Long, low calls, soft at first, and then rising, not aggressive, not alarmed, just present. Rosie's trunk shifted through the dirt. She lifted her head an inch, then let it fall back. On the third pass, she tried again, this time raising it higher. The effort made her whole body shake. Her breath came rougher, but she was no longer lying there like a creature waiting for the world to end. Nora sank to her knees beside the tarp, tears already gathering though she tried to hide them. Emily reached one hand toward Rosie's shoulder without touching her, afraid of interrupting something too delicate for human hands. Caleb lowered the volume and let the call loop softly. He knew better than to flood the moment. The point was not to overwhelm Rosie. It was to remind her she had not always been alone. For several minutes, that was all the field held. An old elephant, listening to the voices of her own kind as though they were drifting in from another life. Then Rosie gathered her front legs beneath her again. This time, the movement came with intention. Her chest rose farther off the ground than before. Her trunk pressed hard into the dirt for leverage. Muscles bunched under scarred skin and trembled with effort. Emily stood instantly, ready to support if she could, though all of them knew there was very little a human body could do for an elephant of Rosie's size in a moment like that. Rosie pushed, faltered, pushed again. Her hindquarters dragged, then lifted. For one terrible second, it seemed she would crash sideways and undo what little strength she had found. Instead, she locked her front legs and stayed there, half standing, swaying. The speaker played another rumble, softer now, and Rosie turned her head toward it. That motion, more than anything else, broke Emily open. Rosie was not rising because of pain or panic or the presence of people. She was rising toward a voice, toward memory, toward the possibility that somewhere beyond the road, beyond the field, there might still be another living being waiting to answer her back. She did not fully stand that afternoon. Not yet. After a long, shaking effort, Rosie lowered herself down again with more control than before, her breath ragged but steady. Even so, something in the field had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt interrupted. As the light thinned into evening, Rosie kept one ear turned toward the distant sanctuary, listening as if she had remembered a door still existed. By the time the transport trailer was backed up to the edge of the field, the sun was already sliding lower, draining the color out of the grass. Rosie had not lain fully still again after hearing the recordings. She remained alert in the smallest ways, one ear tipped toward the speaker, her eye open more often now, as if some long-buried instinct had been disturbed and would not settle back to sleep. Getting her up was not dramatic. It was slow, exhausting, and painfully uncertain. Caleb and Emily worked from opposite sides, careful not to crowd her, while Nora stayed near Rosie's shoulder and kept speaking in the same low, steady voice she had used all day. The speaker played in intervals, never too loud, only enough to keep that distant thread of recognition from slipping away. Rosie tried 3 times before she found her footing. The first attempt ended with her knees buckling almost immediately. The second got her halfway upright before her hind legs trembled so violently Caleb had to step back in case she fell sideways. On the third, she rose inch by inch, swaying hard enough to make Emily's heart climb into her throat. But this time, Rosie stayed up. Standing revealed how much damage lying down had hidden. Her weight shifted unevenly off her front left leg. Her shoulders looked too sharp beneath her hide, and every breath tugged visibly at her ribs. Yet even in that state, there was something immense about her again, something that made the field seem smaller. Rosie turned her head toward the open trailer and listened when the elephant calls drifted from inside. They had lined the trailer with fresh hay, hung water within reach, and padded the interior walls to soften the ride. It still took nearly an hour for Rosie to cover the short distance from the tarp to the ramp. She moved in fragments. One step, pause, another step, longer pause, as though each motion had to be argued for inside her body before it could happen. Nobody rushed her. At the bottom of the ramp, Rosie froze. The light inside the trailer was dimmer than the fading field, and the metal floor gave off a hollow scent of old transport and disinfectant. For a long moment, she simply stood there, trunk hanging, ears still. Emily thought they might lose her nerve then. But the recording played once more, low and familiar, and Rosie lifted one foot and set it on the ramp. The sound of her weight on the boards made Nora close her eyes for a second. Another step followed, then another. Caleb kept one hand near the side rail without touching her, ready if she slipped. Emily watched the line of Rosie's spine, the subtle shaking through her back legs, the stubborn way she kept moving despite it. By the time Rosie crossed into the trailer, dusk had already begun gathering at the edges of the field. No one celebrated. The moment felt too fragile for triumph. Caleb secured the gate quietly behind her. Nora climbed into the support truck with the supplies. Emily stayed in the trailer itself, seated on a folded blanket several feet from Rosie's shoulder, close enough to watch her breathing, but far enough not to feel like another pressure she had to endure. The engine started, and the whole space shifted beneath them. Rosie did not panic during the drive. That was almost harder to witness than fear would have been. She stood the entire 40 minutes with her head lowered and her trunk hanging limp, as motionless as cargo. Only once did she react, when the trailer hit a rough patch and a metallic rattle sounded near the latch. Her entire body tightened at once, every muscle locking. Then, just as quickly, she went still again. Emily noted it without writing anything down. She had a growing sense that Rosie's trauma lived in sound as much as pain. Chains, hooks, metal gates, tools dropped in anger. There were stories the body learned without language and remembered without permission. Watching Rosie brace against every unfamiliar vibration, Emily realized that arriving at Blue Haven would not feel like rescue to her. It would just feel like a new place to survive. Night had fully fallen by the time the gates of the sanctuary swung open. Headlights swept over fencing, trees, and the pale edge of a pond beyond the intake yard. Somewhere deeper inside the property, an elephant called once, then fell quiet. Rosie's ear shifted toward it, but the rest of her did not move. When the trailer stopped, she stayed exactly where she was, rigid and waiting, as if still expecting an order she did not understand. The intake enclosure had been prepared before they arrived. Fresh sand had been spread over the ground to cushion her feet. Water stood in a wide trough beneath a shelter roof. Bales of hay, cut fruit, soaked pellets, and cane were arranged in separate piles in case preference might matter. Everything about the place was designed to signal safety. None of it meant anything yet to the elephant standing inside the trailer door. Caleb lowered the ramp. Nora stepped down first and turned back toward Rosie, her voice soft, patient, almost conversational. Emily moved carefully along the side wall, giving Rosie a clear path rather than trying to lead her. For several endless seconds, Rosie did not respond. Then, with the same mechanical obedience she had shown in the field, she took one step forward, then another, until her feet touched sanctuary ground. She walked to the center of the enclosure and stopped. That was all. She did not look at the water. She did not reach for the hay. She did not test the fence line, or the trees, or the shelter. She simply stood there beneath the night sky, her body inside safety, while something essential remained locked far away from it. Even the other elephants, calling now and then from distant paddocks, seemed unable to reach her. Later, after the equipment had been unloaded and the trailer pulled away, Emily remained outside the fence with Nora, while Rosie stood motionless in the dim light. Crickets had begun in the grass. The air smelled of wet earth and cut hay. Blue Haven was quiet in the gentle, ordinary way of places where no one was hurting anything. Yet Rosie held herself like a prisoner, newly moved, not freed. Nora whispered that maybe she was just exhausted, and Emily nodded because it was kinder than saying what she really feared. Exhaustion alone did not explain the emptiness in Rosie's stance. This was something deeper, older, harder to name. They had gotten her out of the field. They had kept her alive through the drive. But as the first sanctuary night settled around them, it was painfully clear they had not reached her yet. Morning came softly over Blue Haven, with a pale wash of light moving through the trees and settling over the intake yard. Rosie was standing in the exact same place where they had left her the night before. She had not touched the hay. She had not gone near the water until sometime before dawn, and even then only enough to keep herself going. Survival, nothing more. From the fence line, Emily watched Rosie's stillness with a growing ache she could not quite hide anymore. The elephant's eyes were open, but dull. Her trunk hung straight down without curiosity. Even the flies landing along her shoulder barely seemed worth noticing. It was not stubbornness. Emily knew the difference. This was a creature who had spent so long obeying pain that freedom itself no longer made sense. Nora brought fresh fruit again, changing the arrangement as if the shape of the offering might matter. Bananas on one side, melon on the other, cane laid in easy reach. Rosie ignored all of it. Caleb checked her overnight vitals, adjusted the treatment schedule, and kept his voice low. No one wanted to say the truth too plainly. They had saved her body. Her mind was still standing in that field. Just after mid-morning, a second elephant was brought to the adjacent enclosure. Her name was Grace. She was broad-headed, steady, older, with the quiet authority of an animal who did not need to prove anything to anyone. Years earlier, she had been pulled from a traveling circus after decades of isolation and performance. Blue Haven had rebuilt her slowly, and somewhere in that process, Grace had become the sanctuary's gentlest teacher. Grace did not rush toward Rosie when the gate closed behind her. She simply stood there for a moment, feeling the air with her trunk, listening. Rosie did not turn. She did not react the way she had to the distant recordings in the field. For a painful second, Emily thought even this would fail. Then Grace let out a low rumble, so deep it seemed to move through the ground before it reached the ear. Rosie's right ear shifted. It was slight, but unmistakable. Grace answered with another rumble, softer this time, and took 3 slow steps toward the shared fence. She stopped short of it, leaving Rosie space. The contrast between them was almost unbearable. One elephant carried herself with calm, lived-in certainty. The other looked as if every part of her had been instructed to disappear without causing trouble. The minutes stretched. Nora wiped at her eyes and pretended she was brushing hair from her face. Caleb leaned against the rail with his arms folded, saying nothing at all. Emily could hear the water pump cycling somewhere behind the barn, birds moving through the trees, the ordinary small sounds of a safe place. Rosie remained still, but not empty now. She was listening, and that alone changed the air between them. Grace moved again, closer this time, until her shadow touched the fence. She extended her trunk through the rails as far as it would go, not forceful, not demanding. She did not prod Rosie or wave for attention. She simply reached and rested the tip of her trunk against the outer edge of Rosie's ear with a tenderness so precise it felt almost human, though it was something older and wiser than that. Rosie flinched, not violently, just enough to show that the contact had reached somewhere buried deep inside her. For one suspended moment, Emily thought she might pull away completely and retreat into that same terrible blankness. Instead, Rosie stayed where she was. Her ear trembled once beneath Grace's touch. Then her trunk began to rise, slowly, uncertainly, as if the muscles themselves could barely remember what comfort was for. The movement was so gradual it hurt to watch. Rosie lifted her trunk only a few inches at first, then paused, shaking with the effort. Grace did not move. She waited. Her whole body seemed to radiate patience. Rosie tried again, higher this time, until the tip of her trunk hovered in the air between them. Then, with the fragile hesitation of someone stepping back into light after years underground, she reached the final distance. Their trunks touched. Emily turned away for a second, because the force of it caught her completely off guard. Nothing in veterinary school had prepared her for how small a gesture could feel like a resurrection. Nora let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob. Caleb pressed his hand hard against the fence rail and stared at the ground. Between the two elephants, no drama followed. Just contact. Warm, steady, undemanding contact. They stayed that way for several minutes, trunks resting together through the bars, while the yard held still around them. Grace gave one more soft rumble, and this time, Rosie answered. The sound that came out of her was rough and quiet, more broken vibration than full voice, but it was hers. It was the first thing Rosie had offered the world that was not pain, not obedience, not mere endurance. Grace eventually lowered her trunk and stepped back without insistence, as if she understood the moment had to end before it became too much. Rosie kept her trunk lifted a second longer, then let it fall. But she was different now. Her eye was brighter, not healed, not happy, but awake in a way it had not been the day before. Something had entered her expression that Emily had almost stopped hoping to see. That evening, as dusk pooled gold across the intake enclosure, Nora came running from the feed shed without bothering to hide her excitement. Rosie had eaten. Not much, only a few strips of cane and a mouthful of grass pulled from the edge of the shelter. But she had chosen it herself. Emily stood at the fence in the falling light and watched the old elephant chew, slow and thoughtful, as if relearning the purpose of hunger. When darkness settled over Blue Haven, Rosie was still standing, but no longer like a statue abandoned in place. She had shifted closer to the side of the enclosure nearest Grace. The distance between them was small now, measured not in yards, but in trust. Emily stayed there longer than she meant to, listening to the low night sounds of the sanctuary, while somewhere just beyond the fence, Grace rumbled once more into the dark. Over the next few days, Rosie began to change in ways so small they would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent hours watching her. She shifted where she stood during the night. She drank without being guided to the trough. She pulled at the hay once in the morning, and again near dusk. Nothing about it looked eager, but it was movement, and movement meant she had not turned away completely. Grace returned to the fence several times a day, never with urgency, never asking more than Rosie could give. Sometimes she rumbled softly. Sometimes she only stood there, breathing in that slow, grounded way older elephants do when they are at peace with themselves. Rosie started drifting closer before Grace even arrived, as if her body had begun to recognize a comfort her mind still didn't trust. Emily tried not to read too much into each improvement, but hope kept slipping in anyway. Rosie's eye followed the people around her now. Her trunk occasionally explored the air before settling again. Once, when Nora brought sliced melon, Rosie picked up one piece, held it for a moment, and then ate it with such careful deliberateness that Nora turned away smiling through tears she did not bother to hide. But progress did not move in a straight line. On the 5th morning, a young grounds worker crossing the yard lost his grip on a metal bucket. It hit the concrete edge of the pump house with a sharp, ringing clang that split the calm open in an instant. Every bird in the trees seemed to lift at once. Grace froze, and Rosie, for one terrible second, looked as though the sanctuary itself had disappeared. She lurched backwards so quickly her hind legs slid in the sand, her ears pinned flat against her head. Her trunk curled tightly to her chest, not in aggression, but in a posture that felt heartbreakingly defensive. Emily was already moving before her mind caught up, but she stopped herself short of entering the enclosure. The last thing Rosie needed in that moment was a human body rushing toward her. Rosie backed into the corner near the shelter and stood there trembling so hard the loose skin along her ribs quivered with it. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. Emily could see the memory without knowing its exact shape. Metal, striking metal. A chain jerked hard, a hook dropped, a gate slammed before pain followed. Trauma did not need language to return. It only needed a sound in the right key. No one spoke above a whisper after that. The grounds workers stood pale and stricken by the pump house, the bucket still rolling in a slow circle before settling flat. Caleb signaled everyone else away from the intake yard. The sanctuary, usually full of practical movement, seemed to pull itself inward around Rosie's fear. Across the fence, Grace stepped closer and let out a long, steady rumble that felt less like a call than an anchor. At first, Rosie did not respond. She kept staring toward the source of the noise, as if expecting something worse to come. Grace rumbled again. Then she reached her trunk through the fence and laid it gently across the air near Rosie's shoulder, not quite touching, only offering the shape of contact. Minutes passed that way, slow and almost unbearable. Finally, Rosie's breathing began to lengthen. By afternoon, the tremors had eased, but the damage of the moment lingered. Rosie would not leave the corner for hours. Emily sat outside the fence with her chart open on her lap and wrote very little, because the important facts were not medical anymore. Loud, metallic impact, extreme panic response, recovery dependent on Grace's presence. Some wounds had closed in the body. Others had merely gone underground and waited. That evening, after the air cooled and the shadows stretched long across the yard, Nora suggested trying something different the next day. Beyond the intake enclosure, under a stand of broad-leafed trees, Blue Haven had built a shallow mud wallow for the elephants to cool themselves, coat their skin, and play. Grace used it constantly. Rosie had noticed it too. She often stood at a distance, watching, but never moved any closer. Emily understood the hesitation the moment Nora said it aloud. In places where elephants were worked hard and punished often, rest itself could become dangerous. Cooling off at the wrong time, stopping without permission, choosing comfort over obedience. Any of it could bring pain. If Rosie had learned that lesson young enough, then even the sight of open mud might carry the shape of punishment inside it. The next afternoon, they opened the access gate and let Grace wander toward the wallow, while Rosie stood several yards back, watching. Grace stepped into the mud with exaggerated pleasure, lowering herself with theatrical slowness until the water lapped at her sides. Then she rolled, splashed, lifted her trunk, and sent a shining sheet of muddy water over her own back, like an animal performing joy on purpose. Nora actually laughed, the sound brief and surprised, because Grace was being so obvious about it. Caleb shook his head and smiled despite himself. Rosie stood frozen at the edge of the path, one foot half lifted, trunk swaying in tiny, uncertain motions. Nothing bad happened. No sharp command came. No stick struck a rail. No one punished Grace for taking up space in the afternoon, as if pleasure were allowed here. Rosie moved at last, with the caution of something approaching a trap she desperately wanted to believe was not a trap. She extended one front foot and placed it into the wet edge of the wallow. Then she stopped. She waited there a long time, her body tense, testing the silence around her. When none of the old consequences arrived, she stepped in farther, mud rising around her feet like a world-changing temperature. Grace gave a low, approving rumble and shifted aside to make room. Rosie lowered her trunk to the surface and touched the water, drawing it back as if even that small coolness surprised her. Then, with aching slowness, she bent one leg and then the other, until her chest sank into the mud. The sound she made was almost too soft to hear, but Emily saw it in the way Rosie's mouth loosened and her eye finally softened. She did not roll all the way under that first time. She did not trumpet or play, but she stayed there for nearly 20 minutes, letting the mud hold her while the late sun burned bronze through the trees above them. That night, when Emily checked the security feed before going home, she saw Rosie lower herself fully onto her side beside the shelter. Not standing sleep, real sleep. The first safe surrender. By the time the first hard rains of the season brushed across Blue Haven, Rosie no longer looked like a creature made entirely of grief. Weight had begun to return to her frame in quiet, stubborn increments. The sharpness of her hips had softened. The skin along her shoulders no longer seemed to hang from bone alone. She still carried her scars, but they had started to look like history instead of an open sentence. Her habits changed before her body did. She learned the rhythm of the sanctuary mornings, when the gates opened and the feed carts moved through the paths, when Grace liked to stand in the sun before breakfast, when the shade shifted across the intake yard. Rosie began making choices. She left hay she didn't want. She reached first for melon when Nora brought fruit. She no longer accepted everything like punishment. That, more than the weight gain, was what convinced Emily that Rosie was coming back to herself. Agency returned in tiny, almost ordinary ways. If a trough was too warm from the afternoon sun, Rosie waited for the cooler one under the shelter. If Caleb arrived later than usual with soaked pellets, She rumbled low in his direction until he looked up. They were small preferences, but they were unmistakably hers. Grace remained near her through all of it, never crowding, never abandoning. The older elephant had become both bridge and witness, the calm presence Rosie measured herself against when the world still felt too large. Some evenings, they stood so close together that their sides nearly touched. Other nights, they slept a few feet apart beneath the shelter, close enough that if one shifted, the other seemed to register it instantly. Still, Blue Haven was not meant to be a place of permanent fences within fences. The intake yard had saved Rosie, but it could not be the whole of her life. Beyond it lay the main female enclosure, a wider piece of sanctuary land where the herd moved through trees and tall grass and shallow water as a unit. Grace belonged there. Eventually, if Rosie was ready, she would have to decide whether she did too. The process began slowly. For several days, Caleb opened the outer visual barrier so Rosie could see the others from a distance. There was Mabel, the oldest cow in residence, broad and deliberate in every movement, carrying the gravity of an animal everyone else trusted. There was Junie, younger and curious, forever drifting a little too close to anything new, before being called back by a rumble from the matriarch. Rosie watched them with an attention that bordered on stillness. She no longer went blank the way she had in the intake yard's first days. Instead, she tracked them, how they moved around one another, how they paused before entering the pond, how they touched trunks in greeting and correction and reassurance. At times, Emily had the strange feeling Rosie was not merely observing them. She was studying a language she used to speak. On the morning of the first introduction, the sanctuary seemed to sense the importance of what was about to happen. Everyone moved more quietly. Nora checked the gates twice. Caleb walked the neutral passage between enclosures and made sure nothing could clang or swing loose. Emily stood by the side fence with her clipboard untouched in her hand, though she knew there would be little worth writing until the choice had already been made. Grace entered the passage first. She did not look back right away, as if she understood Rosie could not be led like cargo into another threshold. Rosie followed only as far as the opening, and then stopped. The ground changed there, from the familiar sand of her recovery pen to the mixed earth and grass of the larger enclosure. It was only a step in, distance, but it held the weight of an entire former life. For a long moment, nobody moved. Junie lifted her trunk from inside the herd and tested the air. Two other females paused under the trees. Mabel, who had been standing near the pond, turned and began walking toward the boundary with the kind of patience that altered the whole atmosphere. She did not come fast. She did not come dominant. She came like an answer, given time to be heard. Rosie's ears shifted forward. Emily felt her own breath catch. Mabel stopped several feet away from the threshold, leaving room for Rosie to choose. Grace stood just beyond the opening, not calling now, only waiting. The younger elephants held back behind Mabel, their curiosity sharpened but controlled. The space seemed full of attention, of silence, of all the things that could still go wrong if fear closed over Rosie again. Then, Rosie made a sound none of them had heard from her before. It was low at first, then deepened into a sustained rumble that rolled out of her chest and through the rails like something old breaking open. It was not panic. It was not distress. It sounded almost like a question asked after years without expecting an answer. The herd did not startle. Mabel answered immediately, steady and warm. Rosie stepped forward. It was only one step at first, but it carried her over the line between being sheltered and belonging. Then another followed, and another. When she reached the open grass, Mabel closed the remaining distance and extended her trunk to Rosie's face with extraordinary gentleness. Rosie held still for that first touch. Then Junie edged closer, bold in the careful way young elephants are, and another female came in from the left. Soon Rosie was standing within a loose circle of bodies, trunks brushing her shoulder, her neck, the side of her face. No one pressed too hard. No one trapped her. It was not an inspection, so much as a welcome written in contact. Emily felt tears come before she could stop them. 40 years of isolation had taught Rosie to live as though she were alone. Now the herd was correcting that lie with every soft, deliberate touch. Grace finally moved in beside her, not in front, not behind, but where a companion belongs. Rosie let out another rumble, longer this time, and something in her entire posture changed. The stiffness that had lived in her spine for weeks seemed to loosen by degrees. Her trunk lifted and moved from one elephant to the next, touching back. Not just enduring contact now, returning it, choosing it. They did not keep her in the main enclosure all day. Caleb ended the session while it was still going well, before the strain of so much emotion could overwhelm her. Rosie followed Grace back through the passage with less hesitation than before, but she turned once at the threshold and looked over her shoulder toward the others. Junie was still watching. Mabel had already resumed her place beneath the trees. The herd did not feel distant anymore. That evening, as the light thinned into amber across the sanctuary, Rosie stood at the far edge of her recovery yard, facing the main enclosure, instead of the fence she used to lean against, beside Grace. The old emptiness was gone from her gaze. In its place was something quieter and far more powerful: expectation. For the first time since they had found her in that field, Emily understood that Rosie was no longer only surviving safety. She was moving toward a life. By midsummer, Rosie had become part of Blue Haven in a way no one would have dared predict that first morning in the field. She moved with the herd now, not perfectly, not without hesitation, but with growing confidence. She grazed beside Grace under the trees, followed Mabel toward the pond in the afternoon heat, and tolerated Junie's playful nosing with the weary patience of someone learning that closeness did not always come with pain. Her body had changed enough that visitors sometimes failed to understand how close she had once come to dying. The heavy angles of starvation were gone. Her skin had regained a healthier softness over muscle. The infections in her feet had begun to clear. Even her face looked different. The same scars remained, the same blind eye, the same torn ear, but her expression no longer held that terrible blankness that had first broken Emily's heart. What surprised Emily most was not Rosie's strength, but her preferences. She had become a creature of opinions. She preferred soaked pellets in the morning and cane later in the day. She liked standing under the largest fig tree after rain. She had developed the habit of nudging the water trough with her trunk if it wasn't filled quickly enough for her liking. These were ordinary things, but that was exactly what made them extraordinary. There were still setbacks. A storm one afternoon slammed an unsecured gate hard against a post, and Rosie startled so violently that she backed into Grace before she realized where she was. Another time, a volunteer moved too quickly behind her with an armful of tools, and Rosie flinched away, with her ears pinned flat. The old fear had not vanished. It simply no longer ruled every hour of her life. Healing had become the stronger rhythm. Then, in early August, another rescue arrived. Her name was Ivy. She was younger than Rosie by many years, but she came in wearing the same ruin in a different form. Sharp bones under dirty skin, old wounds layered over newer ones, eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the world. She had been seized from a roadside tourist operation after a collapse no one there had bothered to treat. By the time the transport reached Blue Haven, Ivy had gone almost completely silent. Emily recognized the danger immediately. Ivy ate nothing the first night. She barely drank. When Nora approached with fruit, Ivy did not reach for it. When Caleb adjusted the intake gate, the metallic scrape sent a tremor through her entire body. There was no outward struggle, no aggression, no panic loud enough to feel dramatic. That was what made it so frightening. Emily had seen that kind of shutdown before, and she knew how deep it ran. They tried the first steps carefully. Quiet enclosure, soft bedding, fluids, food options spaced within easy reach. Grace was brought near the fence once, then again the next day. Ivy heard her, but did not answer. She stood in one corner beneath the shelter roof, as if she were trying to make herself smaller inside her own skin. After the third failed attempt, Nora asked in a low voice whether this time might simply take longer than they had. Emily did not answer right away, because something else had already drawn her attention across the yard. Rosie had left the herd. No one had guided her there. No one had opened a path for her on purpose. She had simply drifted away from the others, one slow step at a time, and come to stand at the far edge of Ivy's intake enclosure. Her body angled toward the corner where the new elephant was frozen in place. Grace remained several yards behind, watching without interference. Even Mabel had stopped moving and turned to look. Rosie stayed there in silence at first. The late afternoon light caught along the ridge of her back and turned the old scars on her shoulder to pale silver. Ivy did not react. Then Rosie made a sound so low, Emily felt it before she fully heard it. A long, deep rumble, slower than the one she used with the herd, almost mournful in its patience. It was not a call meant to summon. It was one meant to stay. Ivy's ear twitched. That tiny motion changed everything. Rosie rumbled again, just as slowly, and stepped closer to the fence. She did not crowd. She did not demand attention. She waited, the way Grace had waited for her in those first, impossible days. Then Rosie extended her trunk through the rails as far as it would go, and held it there in the space between them, offering contact without insisting on it. For a long moment, Ivy remained still. Emily felt the entire sanctuary seem to pause around that silence. Then, with agonizing slowness, Ivy's trunk lifted. It did not rise smoothly. It shook midway, hesitated, nearly dropped. Rosie did not move. She only kept her trunk where it was, steady and available. At last, Ivy closed the final inches between them, and the tips of their trunks touched through the fence. Nora pressed her hand over her mouth. Caleb looked down and said nothing. Emily felt tears come so fast she could not stop them. The gesture was unmistakable. Not because elephants all behaved the same, but because this particular touch carried an echo. Rosie was doing what had once been done for her. The old elephant who had been left in a field to die was now holding open a doorway for someone else. From that day on, Rosie returned to Ivy's enclosure again and again. She stood with her at feeding times. She waited near the water trough. She rumbled softly when Ivy startled, and slowly the younger elephant began to answer. When Ivy finally stepped into the mud wallow days later, it was Rosie standing nearest the edge, watching as if she understood exactly how much courage that single step required. Grace remained part of it too, but now Rosie was no longer only the one being guided. She had become the guide. A year after her rescue, Blue Haven settled into the kind of golden evening that seemed made for remembering. The herd gathered beneath the big trees as heat slid out of the land. Junie was half submerged in the pond, splashing for no reason except joy. Mabel stood a little apart, immense and composed, keeping her quiet watch over everyone. Grace lowered herself into the mud with practiced satisfaction, and near the center of it all, Rosie lay down beside Ivy, not cautiously, not halfway, fully. She stretched onto her side in the grass with the easy confidence of an animal who expected the night to pass without violence. Ivy rested, a short distance away, close enough to feel her presence. Grace was on the other side, and beyond them the herd formed its loose, protective shape under the trees. Rosie's eye drifted half-closed, her trunk relaxed against the ground. The evening light rested on her like something finally earned. Emily stood at the fence with Nora and Caleb, none of them speaking for a long time. There was nothing to add that the scene itself had not already said. Rosie still carried the marks of what had been done to her. She always would. But the field had not been the end of her story. It had only been the place where someone cruel decided she no longer mattered. Blue Haven had taught the opposite. Rosie mattered enough to be saved, enough to be waited for, enough to be loved without being used. And now, as the last light faded and the herd settled into the deep safety of night, she was living the life she should have had all along. Not as a machine, not as a burden, not as something left behind, but as herself. If Rosie's story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe every living soul deserves safety, love, and a second chance, leave a 0. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey. There are more stories ahead, stories of rescue, survival, healing, and the kind of hope the world still needs.